I think the answer is what we talked about before. It's like showing people that motonormativity is a thing and that there are alternatives, that there are viable alternatives to the automobile. And if we invest in transit, if we invest in pedestrian spaces, if we invest in cycling, it does pay off.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Active Towns channel. My name is John Simmerman and that is Tom Babin with the YouTube channel Shifter. Super excited to be talking with Tom, one of the most requested future guests here on the podcast. Before we dive into that, I just want to say, if you're enjoying this content here on the Active Town channel, please consider supporting my efforts by becoming an Active Towns ambassador. Super easy to do. Just navigate over to activetowns.org, click on the support tab at the top of the page, and there's several different options, including becoming a Patreon supporter. Patrons do get early and ad-free access to all my video content. Okay, let's get right to it with Tom. Tom Babin, thank you so much for joining me on the Active Towns podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to talking.
Oh, I've been looking forward to this for some time. You and I have tried to do this off and on over the past couple of years. And so I'm super stoked that we're able to do this. Really excited that this is in the wintertime too, for us to talk about some of the cool stuff that you have been working on over the past decade plus. But Tom, before we kick into all of that stuff, I love to start this off with just giving you the floor for a second to introduce yourself. So who is Tom Babin?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. So I live in Canada. I'm in Western Canada in a city called Calgary. It's a mid-sized Canadian city. It's about 1 million people. And I have spent a lot of time talking about urban cycling and bike commuting. So I've got a YouTube channel called Shifter that's focused on, the bicycle as a transportation mode rather than a tool for sports and racing. It's just about getting around on your bike. And because I'm Canadian, I also think about winter a lot. And this is the 10th anniversary of the publication of my book called Frostbike, The Joy, Pain, and Numbness of Winter Cycling, which really was my attempt at figuring out if riding my bike through a Canadian winter is a viable thing. And spoiler alert, I'm still doing it 10 years later. So that might give you a sense of how the book ends. But really, it was like my journey in trying to discover how I could ride my bike all year round, because I loved it in the summer and I just wanted to see if I could keep it going through the winter. So yeah, that's me. I'm the guy who thinks about bikes as transportation more than I should, probably.
Well, real quickly, I want to give some orientation for the audience as to where we're both at. You're at the top of the screen there where the red dot is, and I'm way down in the bottom, almost as far south as you can get there in Austin, Texas, with the blue dot that's throbbing there. And it's fascinating, how our journeys to all of these, these areas of becoming content creators and all of that. Share a little bit about your background, your backstory, your history. Is this something that you studied and were involved with like formally and professionally, or is this something that is a little bit of an avocation or an interest on the side?
Yeah, I'm an amateur and everything. I don't know anything about anything. It's just I just came to this as a person who loved getting around on a bike. So yeah, it all stemmed from that. So my background is in journalism. I worked at a newspaper at the time when I started bike commuting. 15, probably more like 20 years ago now. I started bike commuting because I got tired of sitting in my crappy minivan. I had young kids and I wasn't getting any activity. It was hard to get any exercise. The commute was killing me. And so I remember the moment I borrowed my wife's mountain bike and said, I'm going to take this today to work, and figured it out from there. And I just instantly loved it. Everything about it was it just hit me in the right way. And so I started doing it. And then I started a blog at the time, back when blogs were a thing, just documenting my journey. I had no idea if anyone would care, but it turned out there was a pretty active, I wouldn't say huge, but an active community at the time of people who were also bike commuting. And so I started writing about it, and this community kind of built up, and we were chatting a lot. And then, my sort of professional life has changed over then. I'm not working in journalism. I moved over to do some marketing and some content creation. And so I wrote the book, and then that evolved into a YouTube channel where I spend most of my time these days creating videos. It really was just me, trying to figure out how video works and trying to find it. And I've been really gratified to find an audience around the world. And probably like you, it's amazing to me that there's like a core group of people who care really deeply about these issues, basically in every city in the world. So that's been really exciting for me to sort of find like-minded people all over the place through that YouTube channel.
Yeah, yeah. And I pulled up the visual of the title, or the cover of the book, and yeah, you just mentioned 10-year anniversary. Congratulations of hitting that mark.
Thank you. It's sort of amazing. 10 years ago. I mean, I wrote that book in the first place because I was looking for resources on riding my bike in the wintertime, and I couldn't find any. So I thought, well, maybe I can figure this out as well. So it's the book is a niche of a niche, but it's been like slowly selling for 10 years now. So I do think there are more and more people who are interested in this over the time. So it's been quite the interesting journey, and researching it really opened my eyes to the potential of cycling in all kinds of different ways. So I'm really happy that it's out there.
Fantastic. Is it pretty widely available? Is it still in print and what, broadly available for folks?
You mean more than the box in my closet over there?
Oh.
Yeah, it's still in print.
Yeah.
You can buy it on Amazon. It's still available.
Okay.
There was a Canadian version, and it did well enough that we did a US version as well back 10 years ago. So it should be available. If worst comes to worst, it's still on Amazon, so you can find it there.
Okay, fantastic. Now, I did notice out on Amazon, I noticed it said revised and updated. I'm assuming that was probably a relatively a quick revision. Was that something? Is that what you mean by the U.S. version of it?
Yeah. There was an opportunity for the publisher I had to create a U.S. version. So I added some content and did a little exploration through some wintry U.S. cities and added that as part of it.
Fantastic. That's great. Well, yeah, and you're absolutely right. It's fascinating too when you think about that whole concept of riding in the winter. And for those of you, who that's just normal. I mean, that's what you have. You get winter. Winter comes around, and you make that decision. And oftentimes it's a pragmatic decision as to whether you're going to ride or not. I had the same when I lived in Chicago, and jumping on my little commuter bike to get to the train station to get out to the outer suburbs, because I did the reverse commute. It's just pragmatic. It made sense. It was easy to do, and you just figured it out. And this was in the mid 1990s, and so I'm just riding a little rickety $15 bike, through the snow, and you get along with it. But a lot of the pragmatic tips that you have that you put out there, not only in the bike but also in some of the videos, which we'll get to earlier, simple things that people can do. And I love your approach is that you don't have to have fancy equipment to do this stuff.
Yeah, that's true. I do think we tend to overcomplicate things, especially in the cycling world that, at least here in North America, is really dominated by sports and athletics, and the sense that a bike should be fast and light and high performance. I just think that really dominates sort of like the retail market that we've got here. So I really like just try to make it simple. I don't think it needs to be that complicated. And this really hit home for me when I first started winter cycling. This was back, a while ago. And at the time, people who rode their bikes in winter were like the weirdo in the office, there's always one or two who would roll in on the cold days, and people would be like, "Oh my God, you rode your bike today?" And I would be like, "Well, yeah, that's how I get to work." And so there was almost like this perverse pride in I'm tough, I'm overcoming the elements, I'm getting through winter. But then in researching the book, when I was trying to find out if this was a viable thing, I went to a couple of cities, most notably this little city in northern Finland called Oulu, which touted itself as the most bike-friendly winter city in the world at the time. And it really opened my eyes, because for people there, they were not riding for performance. They were not riding expensive bikes. They're riding, like what you said, $15, department store bikes in a lot of cases, or bikes that had been in the family for 20 years or 30 years. And they're just using it to get to work. And so I had this moment where I arrived in Oulu late at night, got to my hotel, and then opened the door in the hotel the next morning to go outside. And it was there was one of these great bike routes paths right out front of the hotel. And I saw streaming by me like more people riding in winter than I'd probably ever seen before. And there were like kids and their moms, and there were like, grandmas and going to get groceries, and office workers wearing their nice clothes, and just people like going about their day. So it really was an eye opener to me that, it's not that it's not that complicated. It's not that difficult. Anybody can do it if the conditions are right.
Yeah, yeah. And thank you very much for including this video clip from Pekka Takola, who's a past guest here on the podcast. He's one of the cheerleaders of Oulu and winter cycling and all of that. And you all hosted the winter cycling gathering last year. Is that correct in Canada?
Yeah, we've had it a couple times here. I mean, that's when I first met Pekka. Was the first ever Winter Cycling Congress, and Pekka was there meeting me at the airport. I remember taking this tiny little plane from Helsinki up to the city I'd barely heard of before, and there was this guy with a huge beard waiting for me at midnight with a bike, and I was like, "What have I gotten myself into?" And he's like, "Let's go," and he just took me on a ride through the city at night. It looked a lot like this actually, and riding on snow, the packed snow, which was great. And Pekka's just an amazing guy, and is so knowledgeable and so like open with and generous with his time and his knowledge. So it was a great experience. So that Congress has been going for more than 10 years now, and we've had it here in Calgary. We hosted it last year in Edmonton, which is a city just north of here as well. So I would say like the cities of Calgary and Edmonton are not world-class bike cities, but there are some things we do in winter that are pretty good. And so I would think we're not at Oulu standards, but over the years we picked up some really good things that make it work and make it viable, at least for people like me, to ride our bikes in winter as well.
Yeah, I'm pausing and reversing this video just for a second to point out this really, really cool thing that Pekka pointed out before, is they love to have these overhead cameras broadcast down the stencil, the little lighted version of, so you can tell in the wintertime which side is for walking and which side is for cycling. Now, this person happens to be, I think he's not in the right place, but it doesn't matter. But anyways, I find it interesting that, because your pavement markings get covered by the packed snow and the conditioning of the snow that they do on their pathways, and so they have the ability to broadcast down, illuminate onto the pathway. It just gives a great example, and you mentioned it too, is that there's just tons of people out riding because it's the natural, pragmatic thing to do. You mentioned kids. I mean, the kids are riding at rates that are just amazing. Like 60-70% of kids get to school by bike because they have access to this off-street network of pathways that deliver them to their meaningful destinations, from their home doorsteps to the schools. And the context of Oulu is very suburban in context. Obviously they have a downtown area and they have the university area, but when you look at it, there's lots and lots of single family homes that's kind of suburban in that sort of spread out nature of it. But they had the foresight to have this off-street network of pathways, very generous in size, to be able to accommodate both people walking and biking. Just brilliant.
Yeah, you're right. It's just the foresight. I think Pekka told me the story once of, it really came down to one city planner in the 70s who was looking ahead. And so they've really integrated, those multi-use pathways are often given priority. Like the distances are shorter if you're on foot and bike rather than in a car, which makes total sense. Why wouldn't it be that way? And so it really is, Oulu's a small city that's got, it's not like metropolitan densities, but it's like a somewhat compact. So the distances are short. So all those things help. But really what the game changer are those pathways. And I would say in the wintertime, what makes it unique is the way they maintain those pathways for the conditions. I don't see this a lot. They do it. I've seen that's the best that I've seen, and in that they're reactive to the conditions as they exist at that moment. So
right. What
happens here when it snows, no matter whether it's a heavy snow or a light snow, or the brushes come and sweep it off, or the plows come and push the snow away. In Oulu, it's really based on what's happening that day, and so they try to keep a packed level, like a packed a layer of snow to ride on, which sounds slippery, but it's not. It actually gives great traction. And if the day requires it, they will shave off a layer of that snow to keep the conditions right. If it's starting to warm up and that snow is getting slushy, then the plows will come and go right down to bald pavement. And so the fact that they're so reactive to the conditions, I think, is really what makes a huge difference there. And it's tough to pull off. I think you need a really engaged city that cares about this sort of thing and prioritizes it. But it really makes a huge difference. This is a shot from Calgary, where I live too, and that was a particularly beautiful winter day. But that's not a packed layer of snow. That's just like bad plowing and snow overnight, right? So it worked out well that day, but often we get lots of ice and that sort of thing as well.
Yeah. Speaking of challenging plowing situations.
Yeah, this is what I call snert. I don't know where I heard this word first, but it's this combination of snow plus dirt equals snert. And so after a heavy snowfall, this is what automobiles do to snow. They just chew it up with dirt. And I can handle snow. I can handle ice. I can handle slush, but that snert is the scariest part of winter riding. It just like lifts your bike and like you sort of float through it in unpredictable ways. And so I find that the worst. And one of the problems we have in our city, and this is not that uncommon, is that the city doesn't plow residential routes, doesn't plow residential roads. We plow main roads, and that's it. Sidewalks are left to property owners, which is also kind of crazy. If we get a heavy snowfall on those residential roads, it could be weeks before it's possible to bike on them. So, we've got a ways to go before we're at those Oulu levels of like winter maintenance.
Yeah, yeah. I want to pop over to your channel here and your landing page for your channel. Talk a little bit about and give the history and the context of the channel. And we talked a little bit about the book, and we know that was about a decade ago. When did you sort of get in your mind that you wanted to be a content creator, a video content creator, a very successful video content creator? You're up over 125,000 subscriptions. Congratulations on making that. Can you recall when you eclipsed that 100,000 subscriber mark?
Yeah, it was after maybe 4 years of doing it. So I'm on the slow road to YouTube success. If it's successful, I don't know. I question this all the time. It was mostly just me. I feel like I am a content creator at heart. I just have this. I just want to create stuff. And I want to share my cycling journey. Like, I don't think of myself as an expert that's like trying to educate people. I feel like I'm always learning about what makes cities better, about urbanism, about bike commuting, about cycling in a city. And I just want to share my journey with people. I think the book opened some doors for me to try to do things that other people didn't get to do. And so I just want to share what I'm learning along the way. And so I really take that approach on my YouTube channel. I'm trying not to be preachy about anything. I just want to like share what I'm picking up along the way. So I turned to YouTube just out of curiosity mostly. I had never done much video creation as a writer. I just thought I'd give it a shot. And like, I really enjoyed the process and the audience seemed to emerge. I feel like I've gotten better over the years, but I have so much room for improvement. I have a friend who once told me that I make videos like a writer, which I don't think was a compliment. But I've been, I'm trying to get better and better over time. But really it's just me sharing what I learn along the way. So I hope people take it in that spirit as well. Yeah.
I suppose I write videos, or I publish videos and produce videos like a health promotion professional and former research scientist. I love diving deep in and like having these long discussions on them. But I do notice that your most popular video of all time, 1.1 million views, fantastic. And it was, along the lines of, single speed versus a fixed gear, very bikey kind of related, and took off. But then you've got really solid views on a lot of other like very practical things, like simplify your bike, avoid these mistakes. And the one I love, and I've watched a couple of different times, is, that bike is weird, the Dutch bike. And you had the opportunity to interview Anders from the Plain Bicycle Project, there in Winnipeg, which is just a fantastic story. And I've profiled the Plain Bicycle Project a couple of times. I had Aaron Riediger on, who produced the podcast series on the Plain Bicycle Project. So yeah, I mean, it's got to be pretty wild to see these kinds of numbers. 1.1 million, 700 plus thousand views of your content. And yeah, you mentioned that you've been doing it for a while. I see videos dating back 13 years here. I had to chuckle when I saw the one with Phil Liggett there. That's freaking awesome.
Wow, you're taking me back here, John. I
Yeah.
forgot about those ones. That was even before I would even say I was making YouTube videos. It was like Phil Liggett was in town. There was like this Lance Armstrong event at the time,
Hmm.
and I happened to go, and Phil Liggett was there, and I was like, "Hey, Phil," I just had my camera, I think, and asked him a few questions. So that was kind of fun. Yeah, it's interesting on YouTube, like those videos you mentioned that have those views. It's really like a slow accumulation over time. I find like those practical tips that I put out there are the ones that really have like long lives on them. I think people are just, and it tells me that people are looking for practical commuting information. I think, well, I do have a mix. I try to mix it up. I do bits on urbanism. I do bits on sort of teaching people what I've learned about cycling, but it's those practical tips that people seem to be like searching for all the time as well. So I think there's a real need out there for that. And part of it, I think maybe, I don't know, maybe you have an opinion on this, is it's the complication factor. I think we do tend to make cycling complicated. I feel like if you're like regular Joe who's just like, oh, I think I want to try this bike commuting thing, and you go into a bike shop, I do think you tend to get pushed into like areas where things get really complicated really quickly, or like, what bike do I need? What's the gear I need? What's the clothing I need? And one of the best things I've learned over time is you don't really need any of that. You can spend as much money as you want, and if you like gear, if you like buying that stuff, you can go for it. But you don't really need anything except the bike. I often say like the best bike is the one you have at your disposal. So
Yeah.
I think that might be why you see so many of those long, those views growing over time, is like people looking for advice, because things get complicated out there.
Yeah. Well, it didn't take long. I mean, you see, 11 years ago, 12 years ago, cycling in Copenhagen, 11 years ago. And then you start to turn your camera towards, sort of the challenges that you're seeing out on the roadways and the pathways, a disappearing pathway, and you're like, oh my God. So you're starting to shift a little bit of the focus of what you're talking about, of what are some of those pain points? What are some of the friction points that are preventing people from riding, whether it's making things overly complicated or it's the lack of bicycle friendly infrastructure in the environment. Because ultimately, that's probably the most important thing that people who would ride but aren't riding currently will tell you, is that I just don't feel safe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that struck me very early. Is I was able to ride because I was young and aggressive on a bike, which I am no longer like that. And I see so many people who are like, say, oh, I would love to ride, but I don't know how to get to work. I don't have a safe route. And we have a great, in Calgary here, we have a great multi-use pathway network. We have a pretty good network of on-street bike lanes. It's small, but I was going to say growing, but it's not really growing. We have like a core group of them, but they don't connect, right? There's a lot of disconnections. And I think what I learned early is like those little gaps in the network are just like, that's the end of it for lots of people. If there's a 2-block gap that, as a confident cyclist, is no problem to overcome, for some people that's just it. They're just not going to do it. And we have a great example of like this great multi-use pathway by a river and a great separated barrier bike lane that heads towards it. And then there is literally a 2-block gap where you have to it stops, it just dumps you out onto the street, and it's onto a busy road. And like, I don't ride there. Like, that's it's crazy that there's this 2-block gap to get to these places. But that gap is, I go way out of my way to find a safer route because I just don't want to have to deal with that anymore. So I remember someone telling me early on, like when they ride a bike in a city that's not built for bikes, that they just feel like every time they encountered a little barrier, it was like the city telling them that you don't belong here. And like, if that's stuck in my mind for some reason, and now sometimes when I'm writing, I'm like, oh, here's another reason. Here's another thing that they're telling me I shouldn't be here. Here's another thing they're telling me I shouldn't be here about. So I think that sort of jumped out at me early on. And, once you start to see the city in those ways, it's sort of like, it's frustrating. But also I think I've learned through the YouTube channel that people relate to it and they have the same frustrations, and there is some catharsis in complaining about it, but also to see how easily these things can be overcome in different cities, I think is really sort of exciting for people to see as well. I've often learned, like, I don't know if you've had the same experience, but I feel like every great bike city has something to teach us. But like every bad bike city is the same. That old saying about like happy families are all the same, but dysfunctional families are all different. It's like good and bike cities are the same way as well, I think.
Yeah. I also noticed too, about 6 years ago is when you published your welcome to Shifter and all about this channel. I get the sense that was probably about the time when you really started to feel like, okay, this is a thing. I've been doing this for about 6-7 years at this point. You got your first videos 13 years ago. This is 6 years ago. Look at that young dude. My gosh. Handsome young man.
Look how great my beard looks now.
Yeah. And so you did shift. You went ahead and did, you put a welcome to Shifter, and you really started to lean into that. Talk a little bit about that balance between the fact that, you're commuting to your job, you're doing you've got a career, but you're also doing this on the side. How does that really work for you? And how are you able to balance, being a content creator, getting out on the road, because you do travel just like I travel to produce content. How does that all balance out for you?
I don't know. I struggle with it constantly. I just struggle with it all the time, and I question it constantly. So it's busy. Yeah, I have a day job, which I love. I think I could, it's probably viable to do that full time, but I really enjoy my day job, and I feel it gives me a lot of gratification. YouTube is both a creative outlet for me and also something I deeply care about. And so it's really just finding the time. For content, I just feel like I've got a bit of a routine now that I try to get into. I feel very heartened by the response I get. I think the community really motivates me now. I get amazing comments. I get emails. I get the best emails from people who say, like, I hadn't ridden a bike in 20 years and your channel demystified it for me, and I was able to get out there and give it a try. I had an email last year from a guy who said he had diabetes and he was overweight and he was on medication and he wanted to get out riding again. And my channel gave him some practical tips and sort of gave him a bit of a nudge. And he had all those health problems were getting back manageable again. So, I mean, come on, that's amazing. Like, that's really motivating for me now as well. So I do try to find the balance. I don't always hit it. I try to keep it consistent as much as possible, but I think every content creator tries to balance these things the best way they can. So, sometimes I feel like I'm doing great. Other times I think, what am I doing here?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that about your audience. I feel the same way. I feel like I've got just an amazing audience that are tuning in and watching this content. And I will tell you this, so this is a little bit of feedback, is that you and Ray Delahanty from City Nerd, the channel City Nerd, were the two most requested interviews for me to get, put forth. The reason I reached out to you a couple of years ago to get you on the pod was because your name just kept coming up. Folks were like, oh man, I really love that interview that you did with ... You need to get Tom on. Shifter's awesome. And so I'm really super stoked that we've been able to satisfy that, because it's wonderful when you do get that feedback, that you're making a difference out in people's world when you're producing the content. I do want to shift to some of our most recent content and talk a little bit about some of the trends that we're seeing in this world. You'd mentioned earlier, the other creators that are producing similar content in this world. And I find, the whole suite of the content creators that are, sort of in this active mobility world, just some of the nicest people. I'm super good friends with Clarence Eckerson from Street Films and Mark Wagenberg from Bicycle Dutch. And it just, they're amazing people that are putting, content out on a regular basis and doing it far longer than I have. Talk a little bit about the trend and the emergence that you've seen, especially within the last 5 to 6 years that you've been in the space, because it has grown up. I mean, we are seeing a proliferation of urbanism channels and active mobility channels and all of that. And then I want to dive into some of the recent themes and trends that have popped up.
Yeah, it's been really interesting, and to see this growth. I mean, I wrote a blog for years, but it felt very sort of isolating. There was definitely not a community out there like there is today, and you're right. It felt like it just sort of emerged in the last few years. I don't know why. I think maybe the world was just ready for it. I think there's lots of us doing our thing. Maybe seeing each other on YouTube helped bring us together. I think the success of Not Just Bikes sort of brought a lot of the people who realized like, oh, cities are really interesting. We could do better. I think like his success, he has a very similar story to mine. We did a video collaboration a couple of years ago where in chatting with him, he's like, we both wrote blogs that were read mostly by our friends and family. And then, and he's found great success and he does a great job. And like Ray, like to be mentioned, with those guys is such an honor for me. I love their content also. But it really is like a nice sense of community too. I did an event in Montreal organized by my friend Paige Saunders, who has a totally underrated and amazing channel that touches on urbanism as well out of Montreal. But to see, the transit guys who were there and some of the urbanism folk, like that's a real amazing supportive community. And to see people come together, I think is really great. And I have like mad respect for the people who are like behind the scenes, going to the council meetings every day, like doing the hard work of like facing those meetings down and like, we need people to do that all the time. And I'm glad there are people doing that. I also think there's a role for like the YouTubers and the bloggers and the podcasters in getting more people on board. Like I have a video that's on the screen there called the one that says Car Brain about the study about moto-normativity. And I really think this is one of the hugest barriers right now is the idea that most people don't even understand these issues. Like I think a lot of people who, especially in North America, who've been raised in this moto-normative world where the car is just the way you get around. Like I meet so many people who like when sometimes I go on a rant about like, oh my God, I can't believe transit is so terrible in this city. And why do we only prioritize the car? And they've never even thought about this. Like, I just feel like they've never even like considered it because it's so ingrained. And so I do think there's a really important role for sort of that awareness, like raising awareness of these issues out there too. So I like to think maybe like the time was just right for all these people to come together and maybe it's become a bit of a community. So I don't know. What's your theory on all this? You've kind of followed this very similar path.
Yeah, absolutely. And with my background in public health, I've been really, kind of looking at this over the last 20 years of shifting towards how the built environment encourages healthy, active living. And so, the work by Ian Walker, professor out in Wales that, coined the term moto-normativity or car brain is a term that we've used, and windshield bias is a term that we've used for many, many years. But really, equivalate, making that comparison to, and there you go, there's, how do you spell it? Moto-normativity.
There you go.
Making that comparison to cigarette smoke and some of the studies that were done to like say, well, why is it we just kind of accept this, and this might be, and the example being used is, tailpipe exhaust versus cigarette smoke and secondhand smoke. And it's like the level of acceptance that we have in our brain really brings us back to a lot of the framing and the way that stuff has been done. And Grant Innes does a fabulous job in his book, Dark PR, to talk about just how masterful those marketers were in the framing messages to us that really helped shape, in addition to the built environment, really helped shape our thought processes of really, coming to understand that or believe that there's only one way, car culture. And so it's very, very interesting and insidious, how it all comes together. But what's really cool is that, like, it seems like it's really had, to your point, it's really all come together in the last few years where we're having these discussions and looking at this sort of stuff. So I'm super excited to see this really kind of hitting, the zeitgeist. And I get really excited when some of our material and the content that we're talking about permeates out into the mass market and mass media, and the general population is going, oh, wow, I hadn't thought of it that way.
Yeah, I love to see that too, and I do think while the most important work, of course, is that work of going to those meetings. But when you go to a public meeting for any sort of urbanist style, or even like a project around density, or adding a new bike lane, or a transit project, it's not only the politicians who are like behind this. Like most people, most of the things you hear, most of the opposition comes from complaints about parking, or where am I going to drive? Where am I going to car? How am I going to park? That's a symptom of motonormativity as well. So I think those are the people, we need to bring people along with us. And I think, there are lots of ways of doing it. Hopefully we are a small part of bringing some of those people along.
Yeah, and this is just some visuals, continuing from that particular video on motonormativity and the challenges that we have with the fact. Oh, and I know what I was going to say too is that you just mentioned, the challenges of like the population at large is, we realize when we go to those open houses and cities are trying to move things along and make some changes. And then when you realize the resistance from the overall population, it really drives home just how hard it is to change. And as a behaviorist and somebody who's been steeped and trained in psychology, I'm like, oh yeah. Imagine what it's like trying to change health behaviors. It's the same thing, and so mobility behaviors and all of this. But literally, when we talk about changing the built environment out in front of people's houses, there's naturally concern that people have because it feels personal. It's like, oh, wait, in theory, this sounded great, but you're going to do what? You're going to take away parking. You're going to redefine what the space is, out in front of my house or along my route to my kids' school, to my work, et cetera. And so I think we have to have a certain amount of empathy for understanding that we do need to, and this is a tough word for us to, sit with well as advocates, we have to be patient and bring people along and understand that also the status quo is pushing back. And sometimes they do so with misinformation and, not always the best intentions because they have a vested interest to continue the joy of motoring, drive everywhere for everything. And so the vast majority of people don't really care one way or the other. They kind of swing one way or the other. But we do have to have that empathy and patience with them to bring them along. And you're absolutely right. I believe that part of what we're doing with content creation and dispelling myths, which you've got several videos where you dispel myths, is a big part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think we need to, I've been accused of being maybe too patient, or not being strident enough sometimes. Which I think just I live in this world too. I have these conversations with people in my own family who don't understand it, and I see I also live in a pickup truck city, for example, right? I've owned pickup trucks in my life, and it's just if I'm just to go and say if you buy a Ford F-150, you're an evil person, is not the approach that I want to take. It's not the way I move through the world. It's more about like bringing them along, helping people see, and also I'm not right all the time either, right? I'm learning here too. I'm not an expert in these things, so hopefully people can sort of relate to the journey that I'm going on as well. That's the approach I've been taking.
Yeah. I also love the way that you kind of catch on to some fun little trends too. You had Maddie Novich on, and you did the criminologist debunks, and she's talking a little bit about her approach to bike theft. I love the fact that you dove into an e-bike and a cargo bike, and you started talking about that, which is one of the things that she's super passionate about. She's an influencer out on social media, talking about from a mom's perspective of the life-changing capabilities of a cargo bike and especially electric assist. Talk a little bit about, some of the things that, surprised you about, some of these things like a cargo bike, like an e-bike, and some of the things that, maybe the young version of Tom wouldn't have necessarily been all that, supportive of. And you're like, no, seriously, this is really life-changing.
Yeah, it can be. And if you want to talk about bike theft too, this is also one of my projects. Young Tom didn't think much about bike theft, and I'm lucky enough to never have had a bike stolen. But I do think that video you're mentioning is part of a series I've done on bike theft, and I've got a few more in the works now because I really think bike theft is a underappreciated barrier to cycling, maybe everywhere in the world. I do get the sense that for a long time we just accepted bike theft. We didn't accept like nobody likes bike theft, but it's like, oh, it's something you can't do anything about. It's just like the cost of living in a city. And the more I look into this, the more I've realized that no, there are things we can do about it. That video with Maddie, who's like, she's cargo bike mama on Instagram, and she sort of documents her life with 3 kids riding her cargo bike. She also just happened to be a criminology professor, and so she had all these interesting things when I met her.
That was convenient.
Yeah, right. We went for a ride together when I was in New York one time, and she parks her cargo bike on the streets of Harlem and just locks it up. And I was like, how often does your bike get stolen? She said, it's never been stolen. And she had academic reasons behind it. She locks it up. She puts a motorcycle cover over it and removes it from people's lines of sight. And, it really fit into like a crime prevention strategy that she articulated so well because she's so well versed in this. So I was like, oh, we got to talk more about this stuff. This is really interesting. And so that's one thing. I've done a bunch of videos with a guy named Rob Brunt, who is a former Vancouver Police Department detective who was really instrumental in implementing a new program about bike theft, reducing bike theft in that city. And Vancouver, 10 years ago was maybe the worst city in the world for bike theft. The rates were astronomical. And since this program called Project 5 to 9 has been implemented, it's down. I talked to him just the other day, and he said it's now down 70% from when they started.
Wow.
And it's a really interesting program that's really starting to grow. It's based, there's no silver bullet. It's a program that's based around an online database. Lots of cities use Bike Index. My city uses Bike Index. 5 to 9 Garage is the one they use. It doesn't matter. They're both great. But the important part is when you pair all of these strategies together in a comprehensive way. So you have a bike registry database where you just, it's not about who can ride. It's just like, it's a theft prevention registry. You just put your bike in there. You label your bike to say it's been registered. Businesses get on board by changing their bike parking to put them in better locations. Public racks are more secured. Initiatives like at festivals and events, there's valet bike parking. Some cities now have permanent valet parking. Community events. Some businesses in Vancouver offer loaner-like programs. So if you forget your lock, you can just go ask them, and they'll lend you a lock for a couple of hours. By implementing all these programs and by going on some of those crime prevention measures that Maddie mentioned in that video, it can make a difference. It can really be effective in reducing the number of bikes being stolen and returning recovered bikes to their owners when they are recovered by police. It's all done without a crackdown, without arresting more people. It's a program that actually works. But the problem is it's hard. It takes resources, it takes time, it takes commitment, and it takes organization within the community. And so I'm really happy to see these ideas are finally starting to spread. At the same time, we're finally seeing the bike industry starting to take theft seriously too. We're seeing more, Bosch just announced a really interesting program on their pedal assists where there's a tracking device, and also you can shut the device down if it gets stolen so it can't be transferred to another bike. You're seeing lots of bikes being built with location tracking on them now. So when I first started talking about this, 5-6 years ago, it felt like nobody cared, like nobody's doing anything. So to see all these things happening now, it's really great because I do think it discourages a lot of people from riding bikes. Like, how many people have you met who had their bike stolen and then they're done? They're like, forget it, I'm not riding my bike anymore, right? I think it's a huge barrier. So that was not your question. I just went on a bike theft rant.
No,
There you go.
I think that's great, because that was actually, part of my next question. Is yeah, you had that video on the bike theft, and you also had the video on the cargo bike, and how that could very much be a life-changing event for some folks. But yeah, my next question is, what are you super excited about? Obviously, the bike theft is something that you're passionate about, wanting to do that. When we look at 2025 and going forward, what are some of the things that have really got you excited about, and some of the themes and some of the things that you're seeing being talked about?
Yeah, you're right. I'm really excited about the impact of cargo bikes. I don't know what it's like in Austin, but I'm seeing more and more of them here in Calgary all the time. I was recently in the city of Victoria, which is in BC, in British Columbia, and I was blown away how many cargo bikes. They've done a great job building bike infrastructure. There's a great bike shop there that does a really good job, like getting families in and like making it easy, and like getting away from the snobbery of bike shops. And cargo bikes are just everywhere, and they are such a game changer for families. When you have young kids, getting around on them can really get you more active. There's all kinds of cargo bikes being sold out there. It's a cost savings, I think, too. They're expensive, but not compared to a car. And if you can go from a two-car family down to a one-car family with a cargo bike, then you're saving yourself tons of money, despite the cost of that cargo bike. So I'm excited about cargo bikes. I'm excited about the public health implications. I know this is probably something you've been talking about for 20 years or whatever, but I feel like it's underappreciated too. Like the public health impacts of active travel. I think it's one of our strongest arguments in favor of making it easier to walk and bike is like the public health side of it. I think that's, we don't talk about that enough, I think. I'd love to see more on that. Another strong argument that I don't see enough on is helping kids ride their bikes to school again. Like you've seen the graph of the number of kids who ride their bikes to school has just fallen off a cliff over the last 20 years, and like it's hard to argue against getting more kids on their bikes to school because it's just so good for them in so many ways. So I think that's interesting. Personally, what I've been thinking a lot more about lately is like riding my bike for fun, like for recreation. Sometimes I like it's transportation for me all the time.
It's going full circle, yeah.
It's kind of full circle. Like, I went for a ride the other day in a beautiful winter day, and I was like, oh yeah, this is actually fun to do. Sometimes I forget that. So yeah, those are where my head's at. What are the trends you're seeing? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too.
Well, I'm with you on all of those areas, and especially with the area of kids being able to get back to school. I've just been super excited to see the transformation, or excuse me, the explosion of interest around bike bus, and getting kids together en masse and being able to get to school, and the work that Coach Sam Balto has done in Portland to really bring that to a worldwide attention. And he's now focusing his time, 100% of his time, to doing that with the launch of bikebus.world is the website for that initiative, and School Streets programs. I'm just absolutely blown away by how cool that is, and I've had the opportunity to document several of them in Europe, including in Paris and also in Ghent, Belgium. So that's really cool. I'm glad you gave the shout out to public health and that aspect of what active mobility could be doing for us, and that's also interrelated with us building all ages and abilities facilities that do encourage kids to be able to get to school, do encourage older adults to be able to get to their meaningful destinations. And aside to public health that a lot of people don't appreciate, oftentimes they go directly to chronic diseases, blood, taking a look at heart disease and cancer and blood pressure issues and things of that, and diabetes, things of that nature. That's what I cut my teeth on, in public health and working with, populations to improve that. But those are years down the line, oftentimes. What is often underappreciated is what happens right away, which is tied to what you just said, which is, this was fun, is the immediate wellness and health promotion aspect of what it can do for our mental health, what it can do for us in terms of stress reduction and management. Huge opportunities to connect the dots to say that for cities especially is like, yeah, this is not just, fun, bicycle infrastructure for the cyclists. We're talking about this is wonderful quality of life infrastructure for the entire population. So really, broadening that tent and saying that, yeah, doing this really opens up the door for so many co-benefits, including kids being able to get to school.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, I've been really impressed with a couple of projects I've seen in cities where it's not necessarily building bike lanes, but it's really being strategic about modal filters, especially in residential neighborhoods on routes that go to schools or rec centers or soccer pitches or, the places where kids are and families are going. And, just a couple of, jersey barriers to redirect cars, but let bicycles and pedestrians through. If a city is thoughtful about it and strategic, it can really make a huge difference without going through the huge fight of like putting an on-street bike lane that just seems to generate opposition. In residential areas, I think it's, anyone who lives on a street where car traffic has been redirected away from is probably going to be in support of it, even if it means they have to like drive an extra block to get into their garage. I've seen great projects in Victoria, the city I mentioned earlier. In London, there's some really great stuff. You're seeing amazing things in Paris. And they're quick to implement. They're not without controversy, but I do think sometimes they're easier to get in place than a bike lane. And they can have huge impacts on people's lives.
Yeah. I want to pull up the screen here just to give a shout out to one of the videos that you did 6 months ago, which was cycling's gender gap problem. And it's something that we definitely see here in North America is it's still mostly the dudes that are out riding when we don't have truly safe and inviting all ages and abilities facilities and a network of facilities, because we know what the result is when we see, the cycling rates and the modal splits in places like Copenhagen and places like the Netherlands, increasingly in different cities in Belgium, we're starting to see that gender gap tighten up a little bit, if not, in many cities in the Netherlands, the number of women riding outnumber the number of men riding. We need to see more of that here in North America. And I think it dates back, or it points right back to, and I'm sure you talk about this a lot too, in that video, it's been a while since I've watched it, is if we get the facilities right, if the environment's truly, truly welcoming, safe and inviting for all ages and abilities and all genders, now we're going to get there.
Yeah, I think so. That video was very interesting for me, the reaction to it and the production of it. I think a different way to think about it might just be like, let's build bike infrastructure that isn't just for commuters, right? I think that way. I do think that when you talk about a gender gap, what I learned from this video, the reaction to this video is like, if you say gender gap, there is a segment of the population that just shuts down and doesn't want to hear about it anymore, right? Because, for reasons that are stupid. But I think if you just say, like, really what it comes down to is it's not about gender. It's about creating safe facilities for anybody to ride anywhere they want to go. So I think traditionally what we've done is built bike lanes for guys like you and me to ride to work, right, every day. And if you just broaden the target for that and make it families who want to get to the school, or you have to take an elderly parent to a doctor's appointment or go to the community center or the library. If you broaden it that way, then you're bringing everybody along with you, including women. So I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it. And of course, we should do that. It shouldn't just be about getting people to work every day.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that too, because I fall into the trap of, like, when I'm talking about kids, of saying, can they get to school? But it should be more than that. It's like, can a kid be a free range kid? Can they actually get anywhere and everywhere? And then you expand that from an all ages and abilities perspective. Then you include, or elderly, can they get to everywhere they need to go without having to feel like the only way they can get there is to get into a motor vehicle? Can they get to meaningful destinations? And Anna Zyvarts, who has the wonderful book on non-drivers, when driving is not an option, points out that 30 to 40% of our population are some form of non-driver. Can they get to meaningful destinations, through walking, biking, using a mobility device and transit? And so it really sort of like, hopefully, destigmatizes what we're talking about. We're not just talking about bike lanes for quote unquote the dudes, the cyclists. We're really talking about mobility for everyone, all ages and abilities. To close this out, talk a little bit about what you have seen sort of transpire recently in terms of these discussions that we're having, this desire to create a more welcoming environment for all ages and abilities to be able to get around by walking, biking, using transit, again, mobility devices, et cetera, and yes, driving too. Talk a little bit about what we've seen in terms of these becoming hot button issues and culture war issues. Obviously, one of the most notable here in North America is, the premier there in Ontario putting his foot down and saying, we're ripping out these bike lanes because they're causing gridlock. They're not. Spoiler alert, folks. They're not. But it's become a culture war issue. Impart some of your wisdom, as especially tapping into your past experience as a journalist of understanding, of thinking, of digging deeper, and really understanding the dynamics that could be happening here.
Yeah, I find this very discouraging that this has turned into a culture war issue. I mean, it always was a little bit, and if not a culture war, then an urban versus suburban debate. So there's always an element of that, but it really has blown up on this. And you're right about that case in Ontario, which I think is probably going to happen in other places also. And I think it's because the politicians behind it see some political advantage in aligning themselves with the suburban drivers of those cities. I think that's where the real motivation is coming from. I mean, that's the base that's the electorate they're going for. And they think that doing this will get suburban people on board. Will that work? As a electoral strategy? I don't know. In my optimistic moments, I think that most people are probably a little more nuanced than that. I think most people know someone who gets around in their life by bike. If it does lead to more dangerous situations, I don't know. And I don't know if most people understand that, about removing parking and putting it back in is going to make things better. I mean, in Toronto, where this is the biggest issue, you had all the business owners were coming out against this idea of removing the bike lanes. Even the business owners are on board with this now too, right? Which was traditionally was a conservative constituency as well, right? They, small business owners were part of that electorate. So I hope this doesn't spread, but I fear it will. I think the answer is what we talked about before. It's like showing people that motonormativity is a thing and that there are alternatives, that there are viable alternatives to the automobile. And if we invest in transit, if we invest in pedestrian spaces, if we invest in cycling, it does pay off too. I don't know. I also feel like if you have a great urbanism project in your city and people go and experience it, if they go for a walk on a street where there's great restaurants and cafes and trees and benches and they enjoy that, why wouldn't you want that in your neighborhood as well? So, I'm worried about it. The culture war is really spreading. One of the other solutions, I think, is what you just mentioned. I had this experience recently where I was on a bus trip that got in a blizzard and I had to stop it in the middle of the night and get off the bus because I couldn't continue because the highway was closed, and I was holed up in a suburban hotel for the day and was trapped without a car for a day. Right, I didn't have a bike, which didn't have a bike, didn't have a car. There's no transit, and these people who talk about 15-minute cities or walkability being a restriction on their freedom of movement. Well, that's a restriction on your freedom of movement if you don't have a car, which is what you just mentioned, 30 to 40% of the people. So sometimes those people get forgotten about, I think, in these conversations too. So maybe it's a point of reminder for them. So I don't know, there's some random thoughts, but I wish there was an easy solution to it. I don't know, if we would have solved the culture wars a long time ago if there was an easy one, but who knows what's gonna happen. I think we just need to keep working at it.
Yeah. I agree. I think that's, and we have to keep talking and do so in ways where we're doing more listening and less talking, and really trying to understand what people's pain points are so that we can do a better job. Because if we're just preachy and we're pushing our message out to the point where it's not really connecting, I think that's one of the most important things, and being able to connect with folks. Yeah.
Yeah. 100%.
Well, Tom, this has been such a pleasure to finally connect with you. Thank you so much for making this happen today. I'm going to turn you loose to your workday. Again, Tom Babin with Shifter. Thank you so very much for joining me on the Active Towns podcast.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. Thanks, John.
Hey, thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Tom Babin. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, and share it with a friend. And if you haven't done so already, be honored to have you subscribe to the channel. Just click on the subscription button down below and ring that notifications bell. And again, if you're enjoying this content here on the Active Towns channel, once again, please consider supporting my efforts by becoming an Active Towns ambassador. Super easy to do. Just click on activetowns.org, click on the support tab at that top of the page, and there's several different options, including becoming a Patreon supporter. Again, reminder, patrons do get early and ad-free access to all my video content, but you can also make a contribution to the nonprofit Advocates for Healthy Communities. This is the venue that I am able to do pro bono work and do some travel and really help communities out, becoming more activity-friendly places. Again, thank you so much for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. And until next time, this is John signing off by wishing you much activity, health, and happiness. Cheers. And again, sending a huge thank you out to all my Active Towns ambassadors supporting the channel on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, YouTube Super Thanks, as well as making contributions to the nonprofit. Every little bit adds up and it's much appreciated. Thank you all so much.